I have here Professor Roger Cashmore, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the climate skeptics. And could you first of all, Professor, tell us about you?
I grew up doing science at the university, particularly nuclear science was part of that, but then I went on to study particle physics, which is a subset of nuclear physics. And then I've had a career in that in the United States and here in Europe. And I ended up by being the director of research at a big lab called CERN in Geneva. I'm the Deputy Director General. And after that, I moved in and became Chairman of the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority. And that was my introduction more into things nuclear fusion and fission.
So, can you take us through a fast track from 10 years ago when nuclear was starting to be a thing, and then we had 10 years of decimated because a lot of incidents happened, and the connection of nuclear with a lot of negativity and incidents. Suddenly, now that everyone's talking about the energy transition, we're talking about nuclear renaissance. So can you explain to us why, what is the role of nuclear as a pillar in that energy transition, but also your concern, I know you have a lot of concerns about the climate skeptics.
Yeah.
So,
well, let me begin first of all with the nuclear business. It was a great setback when we had the accident at Fukushima. And this again gave a lot more energy to nuclear skeptics. But in fact, it shouldn't have done, because nobody died as a consequence of any nuclear emissions from the power plant at Fukushima. It was actually enforced migrations that caused deaths, as it had been at Chernobyl 20 years earlier, right? Not from anything from the nuclear reactors themselves. But it was a thing for people to latch onto as being something that was dangerous without really considering what the dangers really were. And of course, that played into the hands of a lot of people, and in Japan it was clearly the case, which is, remember, the only country that has ever been attacked with nuclear weapons. And there was a whole community there that did not like nuclear, and they could, every time these things, nuclear latched onto as a bad thing. In fact, it's a very safe way of producing electricity, probably the safest that we know. And so that's where I got very heavily involved with nuclear, and spending time trying to convince people, tell people why it wasn't such a dangerous event.
So, what is the risk? Is there a risk of SMRs? Let's say it is ill use or falls into the wrong hands.
I think it's for people. First of all, I think the risks are very little in SMRs. SMRs. I mean, the first reactors that were ever built 50 years ago produce the same sort of power as an SMR will produce in the future. So it's in fact not very different in a way. Those are bigger objects to deal with. But the SMR virtue of that is that you try and build as many components of it as possible in a factory and put them together on a site and benefit from the fact that you know how to do it, and you can do it without any surprises in trying to put the parts together. So SMRs are good. People getting hold of the fuel, right, from an SMR, I don't think there's any danger in that. It's not it's difficult to make weapons. If people want to think of bombs, very, very, very difficult to make weapons from any of that sort of material. And also to disperse it as well is another thing that people worry about. But it's not radioactive enough to be dangerous, right? The thing that one has to understand about reactors is the energy that is stored in the nucleus of an atom is enormous compared with what in a dead tree, a piece of charcoal or a piece of coal. thumbnail's worth of nuclear material is worth a ton of coal to you. That's to give you a feeling, right, for what the storage capability is of nuclear fuels and why you want to tap them.
Exactly. So what is the role of nuclear energy in the energy transition? Why is it one of the pillars for us to get to full decarbonization or electrification?
It's one of the pillars because actually when you build a nuclear reactor, reactors, when you get them going, they like to just give you energy a constant way all the time. They don't like to go up and down, they like to go pour it out in a very gentle and reliable manner. The other things that we can think of for now getting energy, like solar or wind, they go up and down, and they are not reliable. You have to have another system to go along with it to store the energy at times of plenty, to cover the times when you've got not very much. But the reactors give you a bedrock on which you could keep everything running, right? That's why people like them. And once you've got them running, they will run for a long time without any interference until you need to refuel them. And that's only about once a year, right?
So before we came and sat here, you're expressing a bit of concern that in the world there are still very vocal people, very powerful people, who are climate skeptics. Can you give us an example of who you think is someone who is detrimental to the development of green energy industry? And what do you say to the climate skeptics?
Well, I have a lot of unease with quite a large number of people in the political world, particularly. And we see it at the moment. We know that in Britain, where we are sitting now, that there's going to be an election within the next 12 months. And politicians are taking decisions which don't put off some of the things that will cut down CO2 emissions. They're putting them off because they will, if you do go along with that, you put up the cost of living, as we say in Britain, and that they think will lose them votes in an election. So that, in fact, that's what I'm sceptical about. They're trying to rig it for themselves on the short term. For instance, the current Prime Minister, Sunak, in Britain, he's now pushed through that we were going to stop the sale of all petrol and diesel cars from 2030 onwards, new cars, and they were therefore replaced by electric cars. He's now pushed that back to 2035. That means there will be a longer market for fossil fuels, more possibility of CO2 going up, and in fact we should already have turned over and be going down in CO2 to make the climate objective of a 1.5 degree rise by 2050. We ain't going to do it now, right? I'm sure of that. But it's soon you've got to start cutting down the CO2 because it hangs around in the atmosphere for 100 to 200 years. So if you do something now, it's going to be with you for the rest of this century.
I guess what the old saying is when an issue is politicized, this is when it gets diluted. So I guess we moved into an era where the climate issue is getting heavily politicized. So this is where a lot of people like you need to come back in and make sure to keep it on track. What is final question? Have you followed COP28 and have you got any comments on the outcome?
I've been following it. We haven't seen the outcomes yet, of course. We just seen all the declarations. And I mean, there are some interesting ones, but you notice, for instance, the number of the 22 countries that have agreed on a statement that they will increase the nuclear capacity by a factor of 3 by 2050, which will help, of course. It will cut down emissions. But of course, that doesn't include India, China, or Russia. They haven't agreed to doing that. So the big players in the climate world are China, India, and the USA.
Interesting.
Right?
Do we understand why?
Because they don't like to be. I have no idea really why. perhaps they don't like to be bracketed with the West, I expect.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your time with us. And this was Lina Tayara, Let's Talk Tech.
Okay, thank you. Hope that was a light for you. Establishing nuclear new build in the energy transition. And that for me is the vital thing to do. I believe nuclear is important in all of this, but really it's solving the climate change and energy issues, which is the paramount importance in everything we're doing from now on. So let me just remind you of what the situation really is. Notice this is a thing you can get off NASA websites, a NASA temperature spiral, and it begins in 1880. And I think it's always good to actually refresh one's mind about what the problem is we're trying to solve and to deal with. And here you see, over the last more than 100 years, what's been happening to the temperature in the Earth over the year. And as you can see here, it's all getting a bit warmer compared with 1880. And it starts to get a lot more warmer in the 50s and 60s, as you can see, going out in size. And then it starts to really take off in the 80s and the 90s. So here we go, right? You can see the temperature going and growing, and it's now at 1.5 degrees centigrade, more or less, up some of the time. And here it is roaring up at the present time. And I think it's good to look at this, just to remind you of what the situation, what the job is that we're doing. And there you can see the spiral, right? And you can see the majority of that has come about because of stuff that has occurred from this point onwards. This is the 1990s or so. So it's really taken off. And that's what we're worried about that temperature spiral keep on going, and it's going because it's driven by CO2 or greenhouse gas. You can see here the world's energy use. Then after the Second World War, it starts to take off, and it takes off and goes up and up and up and up until we've got this amazing amount of energy that the world is consuming. It's fossil fuel driven energy. It's 85% or so of the energy that we consume in the world is derived from fossil fuels. Right? That's the problem. So we've got to get out of that one way or another. So if we do that, the issue is really dramatic, because what we're doing is we're saying we're going to replace 85% of the world's energy supply by some new supply, right? New supplies which don't involve fossil fuel at all. Okay? So that's a mammoth task. It's taken basically 80 years to get us to this situation. So what we're going to do, if we want to get rid of fossil fuels by 2050 or get rid of CO2 emissions by then, we've got to do in 20 years what it took us 80 years to construct. That's the problem of our society, all of us. And the emissions of greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane, are the main culprits for that change. CO2 remains in the atmosphere for over 100 years, and it's very mobile, CO2. If you burn something in China, some of the CO2 molecules within a week or so can be around the other side of the globe. So there's no way you can evade this climate change unless you solve problems for the globe. And just as a reminder, methane, why everybody gets so excited about it, is about 35 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. That's why there's all the interest in cutting down methane emissions. The only one good thing to say about methane, it's not a very good thing to say about it, when it breaks down in the atmosphere, and it only lives up in the atmosphere about 20 or 30 years, it breaks down and the product is carbon dioxide. Emissions in this year, 2023, are greater than the ones in 2022, which in turn are greater than the ones in 2020. We haven't flattened off in carbon dioxide emissions yet. So it's only going to get worse, as they say. The largest polluters, if you look at it, which these produce, are China, India and the USA, followed by Europe, which is where we're talking about today. But these produce about 50% between them of all the CO2 emissions.
We do renewable
Hi,
energy.
this is
We do
Lina
the construction
Tayara,
of it
that's
as well,
Tech,
operation and maintenance,
and we're here today at the UKAEA European Nuclear
what are
Industry
the,
Congress.
Investment opportunities in
So nuclear
the
is
region.
having
We
a
are looking into, we know a
renaissance,
Turkish company
and
is
we're
looking
here
for
to find
geothermal
out
power
how
plants
and
in
why.
Hungary.
The AGR fleet in the UK is moving into decommissioning, is coming to the end of its life. We've already had 3 power stations close since 2021, and another 4 of the 5 remaining nuclear power stations are scheduled to close by the end of 2030. Quite rightly, this is a significant draw on nuclear skills to decommission these power stations and return them to brownfield sites. The other consequence of the decline in operational capacity is the need to replace it with new nuclear. So the UK government's energy security strategy has set out requirements for 24 gigawatts of new nuclear by 2050. And if we try to put that into perspective, there is 1 nuclear power plant in the UK currently under construction, Hinkley Point C. That will have operating capacity of 3.2 gigawatts, so less than 15% of the requirements. Therefore, again, in the UK, the scale of the challenge is huge. In addition to the civil requirements in the energy sector, the UK government has also announced the renewal of its nuclear warheads. Given this is a critical government policy and critical for national security, again, this is a draw on some of the nuclear skills that we have in the country. All of this combines into a perfect storm of demand for skills. Now that we understand a little bit about the demand for skills in the UK, in order to inform our recruitment strategy, we need to understand the makeup of the current workforce. Fundamentally, if we continue to target the same talent pools, we will exhaust those quite quickly. We need to expand our reach to all segments of society. On the screen, I have some stats from recent surveys. So in 2021, the nuclear workforce assessment found that 20%, or approximately 20% of the UK's nuclear workforce was women. For those in the room who are familiar with the nuclear sector deal, there is a target of 40% of women in the nuclear workforce by 2030. Clearly, we still have some work to do, especially as the percentage hasn't dramatically changed since 2019.
Nuclear energy and renewables. And let me just go into some of the major goals we have formulated. First, energy sovereignty. Second, energy security. Third, preservation of utility reduction policy, which means a price cap for our households, energy for households. And what can underpin this? Well, provision of low-cost energy sources. And fourth, decarbonization of energy production. The Hungarian consumer is in the focus. We want to strengthen our security of supply. We also want to facilitate a carbon-friendly transformation of the energy sector, and we also want to capitalize on the innovation potential and the economic development potential of the energy industry. So, what are the main directions or interests we have pointed out? First and foremost, the reduction of reliance on energy imports. That's very important to a landlocked country which is not really well endowed with natural resources nor significant renewable potentials. It has regional gas and power interconnectivity, renewable-based cooling and heating systems, the expansion of e-mobility, the household energy production, which means first and foremost PV, solar panels. And here comes the thing, last but not least. By 2030, we want to achieve 90% of our power generation to be carbon neutral. Right now, it's between 60 to 65%. And by the way, out of this 60 to 65%, roughly 50% comes from nuclear energy. So you can see the focus how we want to achieve energy transition to carbon neutrality. We believe that all low carbon energy should be part of the energy mix. This is what can satisfy growing energy demand, growing electricity demand, and of course, clean electricity. Decarbonization is not possible without the use of nuclear energy. We are very pragmatic on this approach. We totally refuse the ideological policy making, which unfortunately some European countries have adopted in the past decade or so. And how are we going to achieve that? First and foremost, the framework, the policy framework. I already mentioned the National Energy Strategy. The energy strategy outlines the key framework, and how we're going to do that? Well, this is written in the National Energy and Climate Plans. These are required by the European Union. We have to update this document every 5 years according to the regulation. We have just submitted, by the way, this year our new version or updated version, which is reflecting already the events of the past couple of years in the energy market. And we have to reflect on those. We have to reflect on practical issues. We have to adjust sometimes our approaches without changing the key target, carbon neutrality by 2050. We need to adjust. Right now, a war is going on in the neighborhood of Hungary. Hungary is a neighbor of Ukraine. So the current geopolitical situation forces us to prioritize security of supply above any other aspects. That said, this doesn't mean that we should forget about sustainability and affordability. We do not want to compromise on sustainability and affordability for the sake of security of supply and vice versa. We believe that the two things must be achieved together. This is why Hungary is following a pragmatic approach in its energy policy, maintaining our nuclear capacities, which provides large-scale, domestic, low-cost, stable, reliable supply of electricity, is of primary importance, which is written in the energy strategy and the energy and climate plans. The energy is a domestic resource because the facility is within the country, the facility is being operated by a local player, state-owned, Hungarian state-owned MPN. 37% of our power consumption and 44% of our power generation comes from this land facility. We have 4 VVR 440 type units. It's a Soviet Russian technology-based unit with 2 gigawatts of overall capacity that produce about 16 terawatt hours of electricity at a usage of above 90% per annum. On the right side, you can see the power generation, the power consumption, power supply, and generation mix of Hungary since the lifetime of the post-nuclear power plant. You can see that the share of this power plant is fluctuating between 40 to 50% in the past 4 decades. And this power plant has been operating reliably. It has been providing large-scale baseload electricity for the Hungarian market. With this huge significance of nuclear energy in our power system, and given the fact that we don't really have other meaningful domestic sources of energy, we are committed to the use of nuclear energy. Since without this very domestic, secure, carbon-free power generation method, our climate policy goals are not achievable. So take it out from the energy mix, then how you can support it from other sources, right? This is why, although this facility is more than 40 years old, we have been considering the use of this power plant in the future as well. The Hungarian economy is going towards an electrification, just like any other economies in the EU, and the industrial development also requires additional sources of electricity, so why not getting that delivered from a carbon-free, carbon-neutral source? This is why the Hungarian government made the decision last year to extend the lifetime of the 4 blocks of the Paks nuclear power plant. The lifetime of these units expire between 2032 2037. We are right now considering an extension by 10 to 20 years, the lifetime of this very facility. But we are not talking about the lifetime extension with regards to our nuclear capabilities. We are also talking about the expansion of these capacities. For this purpose, we are having the POX-2 nuclear power plant project, which was launched roughly 10 years ago, in order to underpin our growing electricity needs from a carbon neutral source. This is a project which is in cooperation between the Hungarian state-owned company POX-2 and the Russian Rosatom. In the framework of this, we are building two new VVR 1200 type units next to the POX nuclear power plant site. This project is a 12.5 billion euro turnkey project, which is currently the largest nuclear power plant project in the European Union with an implementation license. So we're going to have two new units with an overall capacity of 2.4 gigawatts. And this very facility, when it would get connected to our grid sometime in the early 2030s, will be able to save 17 million tons of CO2 emission, in case we compare it with other fossil fuel power plants. This power plant will underpin our security of supply, reduce our reliance on imports, and will contribute to our climate policy goals. By the way, POX-2 is not only a Hungarian Russian project, it's a project of broad international participation. It's a fine example of international industry cooperation in the nuclear industry, since there are American partners, French partners, German partners, among others, participating in this project. Opportunities can be, well, SMR can be modular, can be scalable, can support industrial production, heat generation, even hydrogen production, quite scalable, so it is also pretty much needed in the transforming electricity system. Social acceptance, this morning education as a need was mentioned, pretty much we have to agree with that. Social acceptance in the current, sometimes, I will even say very anti-nuclear atmosphere in some countries is pretty much needed. So the review of the whole kind of framework where SMRs can be included have to be addressed, and the framework of international cooperation have to be settled out. So it's the matter of the upcoming couple of years. So generally speaking, technical and economic feasibility of the SMR should rely on safety, flexibility, economics, and social acceptance in the societies, and of course that's something to check for the policymakers as well. And our general approach to nuclear energy is, again, green transition is not feasible without the use of base nuclear reactors in power generation. This is our standpoint. And by the way, this standpoint is shared by the International Energy Agency as well. No wonder that nuclear energy is going through its renaissance nowadays. Thank God, most countries, most policymakers are not ideologically driven, but they see the pragmatic need of large-scale carbon-free technologies to generate power. As you can see on the left side, this statistic was mentioned also a couple of times today. More than 30 countries are opening more than 400 nuclear units. Within the EU, 13 countries are operating more than 100 units, and in the world there are 15 countries that are right now constructing over 60 reactors. And in Europe, thank God, also the non-ideological driven, the pragmatic approach is being followed by most countries. You can see on the map that most EU countries have already acknowledged the need to keep their nuclear fleet, maybe construct some new ones, but at least not to abandon them. There are also some other countries who are willing to enter the nuclear industry, for example, Poland in the EU or Turkey outside.
Ja want something that would be nice. Actually, this design, we hired an architect from Florida. So this design is the design of our reactor that it doesn't scare people. Now, I told you that in the heating business, everything is about the cost. Yeah? And with nuclear, this is the cost if you use the irradiated fuel depending on the power, and this is the cost if you use the fresh fuel depending on the power of cost. And we can go from 50 megawatt to 100, 150. And if you convert it to natural gas, especially these days when you have natural gas not coming from Russia, but coming from Qatar or LNG, and you have the CO2 credits, you are easily 10 times cheaper. Yeah. Easily 10 times cheaper, but the heating people, they will tell you, we want to have it next year. You don't want to have it in 10 years, you want to have it next year. And the second thing, they will tell you, well, maybe you can build it in small cities, and tell them no. Clearly, there's an economy of scale, and this is actually one of the reasons I believe this economy of scale is not valid only for heating reactors, it's also valid for electricity reactors. So that's one of the reasons I believe the electricity reactors in large power units would always be the extended fuel. If you tell somebody I'm going to build the reactor next to you, there will be some new pseudo-green movement created, mothers of whatever, and they start protesting. So we found out that you have to speak to the local municipalities kind of in secret. They have to do their work, and then you can make the announcement. This is the case study of Pilsen. This is the city of Pilsen, west of Czech Republic, famous for producing beer. And this is their heating station right now, which is actually next to the Pilsner Urquell factory. And this heating station is providing cold to this factory. And when we told them, okay, we can give you a nuclear source, but they were suggesting, let's build it here. I told them, well, that's probably not the best idea, right? Building the reactor in the middle of the city, you can see some railroads here, and then you have the brewery here. So that's the thing. You don't need to build a nuclear reactor in the middle of the city. And that's very often the thing with the SMRs. Everybody thinking, let's take a brownfield in the middle of the city and let's put a reactor there. Why? I mean, electricity can be transported hundreds of kilometers if you get power lines. The heat, believe it or not, can be transported 40 kilometers easily. When you have district heating, you can very easily, by absorption process, like in the skate rink or in old refrigerators, create chill. And there are cities, for instance, Kuwait City or Doha, and they have district chilling systems. So you can provide nuclear source for chilling and chilling. And our strategy is take already existing engineers after the bachelor program and nuclearize them. This is the approach that, for instance, the French were doing a lot. With the INSTM program, they take existing engineers after master, and after 1 year they're creating the nuclear. But we're saying we can take mechanical, electrical, chemical engineers at the bachelor level, and then create nuclear engineers. And I'm sure we're gonna need not 100, we're gonna need thousands of them.
At the end of the 2000s, we had the nuclear renaissance, where there was the idea of more nuclear power construction, more nuclear reactor construction, or life extensions. And then we had the Fukushima accident that stopped all these positive developments for nuclear energy. Now, since 2022, 2023, I guess you all know we have a new situation, at least in Europe. The energy dilemma has shifted a bit. If some countries in Europe before 2020 were focusing a lot on sustainability concerning energy sources and affordability, the aspect of energy security has come up top of the agenda now. So there has been, I think, a rebalance in the energy dilemma, and this has been this has changed the policy of many countries in Europe. Other countries were already pro-nuclear, and those that were not too pro-nuclear were more positive about new developments. So my presentation will be just to tell you about the latest developments, policy developments in several countries. When I say ups and downs, I don't intend to judge the political developments of a country. I'm using that positive and negative about nuclear energy and the impact on nuclear energy. So we start with Belgium. As you can see, 5 units and 41% of nuclear generation. So nuclear power in Belgium has an important role to play. And this has been from a negative development with the decision to phase out nuclear energy by 2025 to a more positive development of at least keeping 2 units operating for 10 more years, or perhaps, if a new government decides so, 20 years. This month, there should be a final agreement for the life extensions of 2 reactors. There are elections in Belgium next year, and as you all know, some countries in Europe have some political coalitions or 3-4 parties that are sometimes complicated. But at least until this year, 2 reactors should see a life extension of 10 years, and that is a positive development for nuclear energy in Belgium. Finland, they don't have a problem with nuclear energy, so to speak, so there is no nuclear phase-out policy like in Belgium. There was one project that was moving forward, but because of the geopolitical situation that we are facing, this project was cancelled. On the more positive side, one large reactor, 1.6 gigawatts, started operating this year. And the government is also more pro-nuclear, so they are looking at the ways that there should be life extensions of non-nuclear power, or non-nuclear reactors. And the utility Fortum is also working on assessing the possibilities of new nuclear. No final decision yet, but they are taking a look at this possibility. As you can see, nuclear power also plays an important role in the power generation of Finland. The Netherlands, there was a government that was working hard on new legislation and ways of making new nuclear possible. Unfortunately for nuclear power, that government collapsed because of policy differences among the government coalition. In the recent elections, we don't know yet who is going to be the next government. So how many parties and which parties. But there's a possibility that maybe one political party that is against nuclear energy will be part of the coalition government. And as you all know, when that happens in any political situation, parties make compromises and maybe there is no nuclear or there is less than before. So until some months ago it was positive, now we will see what happens next year with a new government coalition. The nuclear fleet of Netherlands is very small, but they still want to build reactors. And this is also part of the idea of the new energy trilemma and energy security. Spain, I didn't include any apps because there are no apps. They have a coalition government already for many years that is not pro-nuclear, and they have won the elections again, so they are the government. And unless there is no new government in Spain in the future, we will see nuclear power, nuclear reactors being shutting down between 2027 and 2035. In this case, the nuclear phase-out policy was not decided by the government. It was the utilities, the nuclear operators that decided it. Because the environment, the way of operating reactors, they had taxes on nuclear energy, on nuclear electricity, so the market environment, the politics was not positive. So the utilities decided on their own, we will have this nuclear phase-out policy. But as you can see, there are several reactors in Spain, which is a higher number than the other countries, and 20% of power generation. So it's also an important power source, but they want to be more renewables, and we will see if there are changes in the future. Sweden, also no nuclear phase-out policy, but because of economics, they have seen a couple of nuclear reactors being shut down in the last years. So the nuclear fleet has increased, but it's still 6 units, 28% of power generation. The positive development in Sweden, there's a the positive development for nuclear energy in Sweden. There's a new government there, and they are also assessing the possibilities of new construction, life extensions, also small advanced modular reactors or small reactors. So that's also a positive development for nuclear energy in Sweden. I include in Sweden and the Netherlands also the coalition governments. So the idea is that, as we all know, nuclear power development needs certainty and stability. When you have some countries with 3, 4, 5 political parties in coalition governments, it's complicated. So for nuclear power, it's an additional complication to the ones that we already know about. The next one, Switzerland. In Switzerland, there was a referendum in 2017. The decision was not to phase out nuclear energy, which was positive, but also not to build new reactors. That was the decision of the public at that time in this referendum. So the positive development in Switzerland is that the reactors can operate as long as they are safe. So meaning that now the utilities are looking at life extensions, maybe 60, 80 years. So that's a recent development this year. This can be also considered something positive. My list of other countries is just a number of countries that are, there's a debate about nuclear power, but we don't know what will happen. Norway, there's a company that is looking into small reactors. Italy, they are looking into the possibility of maybe launching a nuclear power program. Denmark is also, there's a company there. Arab in Portugal, but this is a question mark of just mentioning it there, just because to have it in the radar and know that maybe there's something going on. But that's a question. Finally, I think these observations have been already made today. The future of nuclear power is more positive now than 10 years ago. I think we're more, kind of agree with that one. There are more indicators that there are positive developments. In the context that I have discussed, there's more political support, which is important.
And this is Mr. Stein and Lina Tayara for the next meeting.
Thank you very much.
You are the chairman of the small modular reactor business in nuclear energy for Rolls-Royce. Do you see growth opportunities for SMR business in the data center sector?
There are huge growth opportunities, and initially when we formed the small modular reactor business, this was really just going to be power on grid to replace coal-fired, oil-fired, gas-fired power stations with sources of net zero energy. Then we saw other opportunities in the chemical industry, in the production of sustainable fuels, in hydrogen production. But about a year ago, the world seems to have changed, and we were approached by lots of the tech companies and data center providers because the growth in data centers, particularly driven by AI, has now meant that they're of the size where they need their own small modular reactors. And the need is very urgent. We've been at a great conference here today where we've heard the need for 38 gigawatts of energy in the next 5 years just to fuel the AI revolution.
How far ahead will SMRs be ready to deploy?
Our current schedule, and we're going through a regulatory process, so nuclear power stations have to go through a regulating checks for the safety and integrity of the power source. We're planning on going through that over the next 2 or 3 years, then starting to build our first few and getting first power on grid in about 2030 or 2031.
And any indications on the cost of nuclear energy in comparison to other renewable energies?
Yes, so the cost of a power station, and I'll have to start switching between currencies here, is around about $2.5 billion for a 470 megawatt power station. Now, one of the things about nuclear energy is the running costs of nuclear energy are actually quite low, tens of millions of euros a year, and the cost is dominated by the cost of capital, in other words, how much it costs you to raise that $2.5 billion for each power station. Now, with a decent cost of capital, and decent, I'm talking 4 or 5%, we should be able to produce energy at around about 50 to 60 euros a megawatt hour. I'm sorry to switch between dollars and euros. But at that price point, if you include the cost of energy storage, then I think we're going to be undercutting wind. It's true that wind without energy storage can get cheaper than that, but in a real world situation powering a data center where you need 24/7 energy with 5 nines reliability, you're going to have energy storage if you're using wind as the energy source.
Well, if we're going to meet here in a year's time, what would the story be then?
In a year's time, I think the business would hope to have a far closer relationship with the big data center operators, the big tech companies. I think we can lead them on a path that will mean we can guarantee to get to net zero with a far earlier date than we could if simply they were hoping that the market will provide the electricity at net zero. So really it's about cooperation, it's about partnership, and it's about the energy industry and the data center industry coming together because they need to.